to the Placement Exchange Candidate Webinar Series. We're really excited to talk with you today about resume structure. And so if you have any questions or anything like that throughout the presentation, if you look to the bottom of your GoToWebinar window there's a questions box. And so if you have questions throughout, please feel free to type them in and we'll do our best to answer them throughout the webinar. We also have a list of questions that was sent in by candidates as you registered that we might be able, or we're hoping a lot of that content's already in the presentation, but if not, and you have any more questions at the end, we'll have time for that. So please feel free to ask questions throughout and we'll answer them. This webinar will also be posted online on the Placement Exchange YouTube channel. And so just if you were unable to, if you want to watch it again, or if there was somebody who was unable to attend, you can feel free to just YouTube afterward and see the webinar there. And so to introduce the presenters here, my name again is Donald Walker. I work at Towson University and I'm working with the Placement Exchange this year, and I'll serve as today's moderator.
Hi everyone, I'm Jonathan Martinez. I am currently an academic advisor and an internship coordinator in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication, specifically here at New York University. And I'm actually, I went to the Placement Exchange a few years back, almost 8 years now actually ago, and I've also done some work there doing recruitment as well as a few other recruitments in other places. So looked at a lot of resumes over my time.
Hi everybody, this is Tom Park. I'm an area coordinator at the University of Mississippi in the Department of Student Housing. I have been doing recruitment as chairs and as members of committees for the past about 8 or 9 years so far, and have also, as Jonathan stated, looked at a lot of resumes in those years.
Donna, are you going to go over that?
I'll do this one. So the outcomes and overview for today, just wanted to let everybody know. So as a participant, you should be able to learn today how to articulate a variety of methods to structure a student affairs resume. We want you to be able to also identify some specific techniques to narrow down some fonts, colors, and general formats for resumes, because those often come up when we talk about the resume structure. Then also determine appropriate length of content to provide potential employers. And so there's a lot of different methods that people can use, and so those are some of the things that we will talk about today. Just an overview of today's presentation as well is that we'll go over the look, some of the structure, the length, and then other tips, tricks, and advice. One of the things that we wanted to make sure that we ensure today is that the information that will be provided is definitely Jonathan and Tom's personal experience and personal point of view. And so sometimes there's a variety of different ways to do this, but we're just going to do our best to provide a nice overview for you of what the what resume structure can look like.
And we already talked a little bit about ourselves, so we don't want to belabor that too much. We want to get to the content. But like Tom and I said before, we both have had a lot of experience with resumes, and also want to re-emphasize what Donald just said about the subjective nature of resumes, and we'll talk about this throughout and sort of bring that up very often. And Tom and I also want this to be very informal and sort of allow for questions, but we do want to go over this in a way that is sort of emphasizing that subjective nature. So we'll go ahead and get started with the look of the resume and the fonts and colors. With the fonts, it is a very personal thing. Generally speaking, you are going to want to try to keep your resume simple and not let the look of the resume speak more than the content of your resume. So in terms of fonts, both the type and the size, you want to make sure that with the type that you're not getting crazy in terms of which physical font you use. Times New Roman is always acceptable for assignments as well as resumes. Tom and I have had some different preferences for that. I personally am not a fan of Times New Roman, but it won't necessarily be a strike against the candidate if I see that on a resume. But generally speaking, the size should be around a 12-point font. However, obviously, if you have a lot of content and you need to, hate to say the word cheat, but if you need to cheat a little bit, that's something that you can make a little tiny bit smaller to fit more content. But you generally don't want to go too small and make it too difficult for the reader to get through. And colors, same thing. You don't want the colors and the look of the resume to speak more than the content. So Tom and I have talked about that you want to keep the resume paper to just the basic whites, the off-whites, the light grays, and then the colors of the words also mainly black. You're not really going to look to try to spice up your resume with these types of features. The format in terms of the white space, obviously, you want to try to keep the white space to a minimum, mainly just because you want to fill it with content and not leaving the reader to guess what you've done. And in terms of the alignment and bold and italicizing and underlining, again, that's something that's very subjective. However, the important thing to remember is that you should be consistent. So if you have your dates on the right, like I believe Tom likes, I prefer dates on the left, but if you have your dates on the right, make sure that they're all on the right and not some on the right, some on the left, and that they're all lined up perfectly, that they're not sort of staggered in terms of the distance from the right margin, and that if you're going to bold all of your positions, then make sure that they're all bolded and that italicizing is used consistently throughout the page. In terms of resume paper, Tom and I both agreed that most recently resume paper is not used as commonly, and for me that won't be, and for me in particular, that won't be something that will make or break a candidate or a resume. And I think that in the present time we're trying to cut back on costs, and that's definitely something that is true for people living on a grad student stipend, which I was there. And that's one way that you can save money, because that's going to be, $20, $30 that you don't need to spend, and especially since there are resources at TPE where you can print and use that paper there, and you can save that money for sure. Tom, did you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, let me just jump in real quick. I think when you consider the look of the resume, as Jonathan said, simple. I think one of the other things is readability. Particularly with the fonts, you want folks to be able to look at your resume, pull it off the top of the stack, or pull it up on their computer, and be able to instantly read things without trying to figure out what the font is saying. So again, Times New Roman or Serif or Calibri, those are fonts that are very easy to read. And then in terms of formatting, I also I like symmetry. For me, when a resume has symmetry, or just things in general have symmetry, they just appear better. And again, as Jonathan said, a lot of this is subjective. You may have 5 different people review your resume and get 5 completely different pieces of feedback regarding how things are structured or whatnot.
Yeah, and we can move on to the structure piece, which Tom is going to talk about, but I do want to add one quick thing in terms of that subjective thing. We bring that up very often because, and we'll talk about this again later on, but it's important to make sure that you do have plenty of people look at your resume, because since it is so subjective, you'll be able to get a little bit from everyone in terms of the structure and in terms of all the content as well.
So regarding the structure, contact information, that's important. To start off, obviously your name should be highlighted at the top, whether you want that to be slightly larger font size, as well as bolded. And then the question about addresses, whether or not to put an address, whether or not to put your current address and a permanent address. That is something I think it's going to be personal. I think having an address in general helps to kind of round out the look and the structure. But you know, nowadays there is not a lot of mail, actual postal mail going out regarding recruitment, regarding applying for positions. 10 years ago, human resources may be sending physical letters home saying, please fill out this information or thank you or whatnot. But today a lot of that happens by email. And then for an email, Jonathan and I really believe that it's having a personal email address that is a professional, professionally created, whether it's a Gmail, whether it is, folks still have Yahoo email addresses, but nothing too fancy or outlandish, like, I love pugs, 123. Having your name, whether it's first initial, last name, or full name, that is, it's universal for you to be able to use. Education, obviously you should put your education. That should be the second section that you have on your resume after your name and contact information. There's debate about GPAs. I think for me, I look at whatever you put on your resume, what is the purpose? Is there a purpose for putting your GPA aside from wanting potential employers to see that you had a 4.0 or you had a 3.5? Personally, if the position is not academically related, then I don't see the need for a GPA. For a hall director position, or a an advising position, student activities, things like that. Ask yourself, is my reporting of my GPA important for the position and for the employer to know? And that, in general, can be used for any of the other content that you put in. Regarding objectives and value statements, I think Jonathan and I are fairly almost 100% in agreement that these are not things that are very standard within a student affairs resume. There aren't a lot of standards when you think of student affairs resumes. It's not as if the accounting field or the medical field, those fields tend to have standards that are used throughout the industry. As we mentioned, resume structures within student affairs are fairly subjective. Something that I really like, maybe something that Jonathan really doesn't like and could really bother him, and vice versa. So, but in terms of objectives, it takes up space that you can use or that you will need to use for other aspects. Kind of jumping around, in terms of the order of activities for your experience, chronological is one of the things that, if we're going to call standard, is probably the standard. One reason for that is it helps employers understand what you've done most recently. It creates a direction, a path for them to follow, and then it also gives us the ability to identify gaps. Are there gaps that we want to know about? So from there, whether it's section titles, look at things that provide an overarching ability to describe what you're putting in there. So to not be so specific, that's going to give you a dozen different sections. If you can combine different things, whether it's conference attendance, whether it is, being involved in professional organizations, those can be classified as involvement. and you don't necessarily have to have a separate section for conferences, a separate section for professional organizations. One of the things that can be a little bit nitpicky is that experience as for those of you that are graduate students, it's experience. Some folks may not classify you, and when you consider HR, human resource kind of classifications, it's still considered as student experience. So unless you have professional experience where you are a full-time staff member, try to keep those headings or that heading regarding experience as experience, or as they're here on the slide, work experience. Jonathan, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, really quickly with the GPA thing, I think that Tom and I are most in agreement, and I think that the only thing I want to add is that if you do put your GPA on it and you are applying to an academic sort of focused job, whether it be honors work or maybe an honors living community in a residence hall or even at advising, I think that with the way grad school grades are inflated, I think that most people have to maintain a 3.0 or something like that. So if you're at a 3.0, I would not put that GPA on the resume because it is pretty much average. So again, with that, like what Tom was saying, that story you want to tell is that you worked a little bit harder and you were able to maintain a 4.0 or a 3.8 because you happened to get one A minus in that crazy stats course. But I think that if you're putting a 3.0, what story does that tell me? The story that it tells me is that you were an average student, kind of like I was. I mean, it's not to shame anyone. I was a very average student, but I didn't put my GPA on my resume for that same reason. And then the last thing is that with the chronology, I will be looking for gaps on resumes. That's something that I purposely go in and I look for the dates and see how your story unfolded. And if I do see a gap, I will specifically ask about that. So that's why that chronological resume format is very important for me personally. And with a functional resume, if I have to go back and forth between different functional areas and different relevant experience versus not relevant experience and have to go back and forth, it's going to be a little tedious for me, and I'm just going to move on to the next candidate. Moving on to the next slide, in terms of the length, Tom and I were very much in agreement in this slide as well, where in terms of the length, there are some pretty accepted standards for student affairs resumes where if you're becoming a master's level employee, and many of you, or not many, I would say, but a good majority of you would have the experience of going to undergrad and then going straight to graduate school. If you're in that team and you're looking for your first full-time professional position, then content-wise, you're going to be at about 2 pages, and that really should be the maximum if you consider all of the experience that you have in terms of conferences, in terms of your grad assistantships, in terms of your internships. 2 pages for some of you may be a struggle to really fill up those 2 pages, and for some of you, you may need to cut back to get to 2 pages, and both of those are totally fine. Tom is okay, for example, with you having 1.5 pages, and that's okay as well. If you're an undergraduate level employee that you don't have your master's yet, then 1 page really is sort of the standard. Now, for those of you who have more experience and have been in the field for a little bit longer, whether it was pre-masters plus post-masters or either or, then it is sort of known that you may need to wander past 2 pages. Tom and I, Tom was saying, for example, that he's at about 5 or 6, right, Tom?
About 4 right now.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. And since I'm starting to work on my doctorate, and Donald may also interject on this, the length starts to get a little bit longer. So you start to look into 3, 4 pages, but essentially you're right around there. In terms of the individual sections, this is really sort of very closely related, obviously, because each section, if you make each section 10 bullets, then you can very easily get to 4 or 5 pages when you don't need to be. So you need to be selective about which sections get a little bit more attention. Obviously, the ones that are more related, so if you're applying to an academic advising position and you worked in advising, then the length of that section should be longer than the section that was Res Life. That's my particular experience. I used to work in residence life, so that part of my resume is a little bit shorter now than my advising and sort of academic experience. But back when I was a hall director, my Res Life experience and those parts of my resumes were much longer. Sorry, taking a drink of water there. Generally speaking, you want to make sure that you draw a complete picture of what you're doing, and that can be done sometimes in 3 bullets, but that sometimes does need the 5, 6, 7, or 8 bullets. And again, it's important to think about what story you're telling. And you know, are you a hall director? Okay, great. There's a million hall directors out there. What do you need that extra bullet to tell me what sets you apart as a hall director from the sea of other hall directors out there? Or, you know, did you work in athletics advising? There's plenty of those as well. And what made you different than other athletics advisors? And obviously this is related to the last set of bullets here about relevant information, what can stay and what should go. As you start to get older in your career and start moving toward the end of grad school and beyond, chronologically speaking, the first things to go are obviously the things from when you were younger. If you were an RA as an undergraduate or an orientation leader, for example, those are the things that will begin to come off your resume unless it's extremely relevant to the positions that you're applying to. So if you're applying to a position that supervises orientation leaders, then it's very important for you to leave your undergraduate orientation leader experience on your resume because it's very relevant. You can speak to that from a personal level, especially if you're going to be supervising orientation leaders. Tom in the previous section talked about the involvement section, which is really, that's actually the heading that I have for my resume because it's really a great catch-all for different professional work that isn't necessarily part of your job. It can be committee work, it can be professional organizations, it can be accomplishments. And one of the things that I was going to say for the tips section, but I'd like to talk about it now because it's sort of relevant, is talking about standing out. It's okay for you to use non-traditional sections or non-traditional subsections within a section that speak to the unique experiences that you may have had as a candidate. Were you a run-of-the-mill hall director? Great. But did you create a very unique opportunity in your residence hall that most other hall directors don't have? Then that's something that can go as highlighted underneath and sort of indented in a different way that catches my eye as a viewer of a resume. And that's something that would be very relevant, even though it's something that may not be 100% related to that section. It can either go in the involvement section or in the work experience section. But generally speaking, what stays is what's most relevant to the position you're applying to, and what goes is what is less relevant to the position you're applying to. Unless, again, it's part of that story that you're crafting, because the resume really is a craft. Did you want to add anything to that, Tom?
Yeah, I think in considering the content, Donald, if you can move one slide back, please. Part of, and Jonathan has stated this a few times about painting that picture or understanding your story. You know, understanding what your essential functions of each position and then how to put that into bullets is important. You know, yes, I think we all have a fairly good understanding of what a hall director is and what a hall director does, what their essential functions are. But that doesn't mean that just because we all understand that, that you shouldn't actually list what your essential functions are. Here at the University of Mississippi, we don't have to glean from a candidate's resume what their responsibilities have been. A candidate may put that they were a hall director, but if they just put that as a simple bullet that they were a hall director from this year to that year, it doesn't tell me actually exactly what they did, which and based on our human resources rules, I don't have to actually ever consider what I know about a hall director and what they do, because they didn't put that on their resume. They didn't explicitly tell me that they supervised a residence hall, they supervised, they oversaw residence halls, supervised RAs, had conduct meetings. Those are things that I understand that hall directors do, but if a candidate doesn't actually put that, it's not something I ever have to consider, and I can just move right on to the next person. So, yes. So, regarding tips and tricks and some advice, comparing the cover letter to the resume, as I mentioned earlier, symmetry. It's going to be important that you maintain the same look with font, with spacing. Obviously the size of font may adjust because it's a different format, but I should know that that cover letter goes to your resume. Even if I don't initially see your name, because they have the same look. Kind of along those same lines is with that second page, I should know that your second page is your second page. So putting a header or putting a footer on your second page with your last name, page number, or first initial, last name, and page number. Employers do print out a lot of resumes still. We still use a lot of paper in printing resumes so that we can actually take our pen and go through everything. And sometimes papers get shuffled around. So understanding, that you have a second page and that that particular page goes to you is important. Items to leave out. Again, going back to the subjectiveness. It really depends on where you are in terms of your length, and it depends on kind of where you are in your career. I think we still see a lot of folks listing proficient in Microsoft Office Suite. Is that necessarily something that will make or break a candidate, or is something that is just so mind-blowing that a candidate is proficient in Microsoft Office Suite or the Google apps? Not really. But if you want to create a larger kind of technology proficiency section, where you may have experience working with Maxient for conduct, or StarRes as a housing software, or any of the other myriad of softwares out there, that's a section where you could put that because it has relevancy, and it fits rather than just putting at the bottom that you're proficient in Microsoft Office. Making your structure stand out. This kind of goes along with colors, or with kind of crazy fonts. You want to make your content stand out. I'm sure Jonathan and I can regale you with stories of the fact that we've seen people put an actual headshot in the corner of their resume. I've seen folks, have a monogram on their resume. I've seen folks have a watermark on their resume. These aren't things that necessarily impress us. I see that and I make a bit of a face, and then it's like, okay, that's interesting. What does their content have to tell me? Because it's their content that and what they've done as a graduate student, or as a new professional, or as an undergrad, that will make me want to put their resume on the on the pile where I'm going to continue to consider them. And then regarding pet peeves, I would say for me, kind of going back to the section titles, professional experience is a bit of a pet peeve for me. Again, it's trivial, and it you know, in the grand scheme of things, does it make that big of a difference? No, but you know, we all have our quirks. We all have these things that just kind of make us go, huh? And you know, when you have a student listing that they have professional experience, for me that's kind of that huh moment. You know, doesn't necessarily disqualify them, but it's just one of those things that, again, kind of makes you go, huh. So, Jonathan?
Yeah, one of my pet peeves is when candidates use periods and bullets, and this, again, may be really tiny, but these are the things that over the years that you kind of see. Bullets are not necessarily meant to be complete sentences if you use the bulleted structure. If you use the narrative format, which I've seen a couple times, then you can use periods, but your bullets should not have any periods because they're not complete thoughts. They're, you know, participated in a rotation of an on-call rotation, which is not a complete sentence. Grammar in general is something that I'm sort of a grammarian and a stickler for. So commas that are missing or commas that are there and don't need to be there. Those are and spelling mistakes, big time, are a pet peeve. Again, the creative thing, and I work in a media culture and communication department where my students go on to work in all sorts of communication fields, public relations, marketing, movies, film, TV, all kinds of places. And so I see a lot of resumes, and with the creative piece, I think that when I see a creative resume, I'm more likely to be harder on it. I'm more likely to say, why is this here? What purpose does this serve on this resume? Whereas if someone had a traditional resume, I may overlook some of those things, but because you went with a creative resume, it's more important that the content be very, very good, because I'm not looking for someone to paint pictures for me all day. I'm looking for someone that will do the job, and ultimately that means being able to, you know, put on professional work and creative work. There was a question in the chat box, and I know we're going to talk about this in a little bit, Donald, so I apologize, but I wanted to talk about social media, because social media is becoming a bigger part of our lives, both professionally and personally, and I think that there is a distinction there. I think that there are many positions nowadays where social media will become a part of your job description, whether that be in residence life, in advising, in athletics. So if social media is going to be within the portfolio of things, I think that it's a pet peeve of mine when candidates don't talk about it either on their resume or on their cover letter, or at least bring it up proactively in the interview. So I'm not necessarily opposed to having social media profile links on your resume, as long as that is relevant, and as long as obviously your social media presence is combed through and you know, very well groomed, so that it doesn't send the wrong message, obviously. A few last tips that I was thinking about is in the skills section. Tom talked about this a little bit, but I'm okay, generally speaking, with students, or candidates rather, putting a skills section with, you know, Google products or Microsoft products, but particularly I'm okay with it if you do it to create that section for one or two less common skills. So if you're really, really proficient in Photoshop, for example, which is a little bit less common, I'm okay with you creating a skills section and putting Google and Microsoft products in order to also put Photoshop, and not have Photoshop be the only skill that's on there, if that makes sense. So that's something that I'm okay with, having a little bit of a bare skills section, so that you can highlight the one or two big things that are a little bit less common.
I think finally for me, I mean, and we've reiterated this, you know, many times. This is very subjective. I mean, you could have once this gets posted up on YouTube, there may be maybe somebody that says that they believe in the complete opposite of everything that Jonathan and I have said this afternoon, and that's completely fine. How you navigate all the variations and feedback that you will receive from your resumes, and really, we really hope that folks will send out their resumes and have at least 3, 4, 5 people review it for them. But one of the ways to determine, what you decide to do or what direction you decide to go is ultimately that person you trust the most, whether it's a mentor, whether it's a friend, somebody that has experience, more experience than you within the field. But that person that you trust the most should be, should help you most in developing your final product.
One last quick thing, Donald, I'm sorry, before we move on to any questions that the audience may have. But if you do have more than one page, and I think Tom may have mentioned this, but I want to reiterate it, make sure that you have the same or at least very similar header on all of your pages, whether that be your name and then followed by a small parentheses, page 2, or your entire header just reproduced on the second page and on your cover letter, because I do think Tom mentioned some employers will print everything and will have multiple candidates, and especially at TPE, there'll be tons of candidates, so being able to make sure that you keep all your files in mind is very important, and having that header will be helpful. But I just wanted to make sure that wasn't forgotten, because that was a big thing for me when I was at TPE, both as a candidate and as an employer, is being able to keep all your files straight.
All right. So we're definitely going to open up the questions now. And so thank you, Tom and Jonathan, for going through the presentation. And so one of the questions that was listed while you all were presenting was, what would the presenter suggest instead of the professional experience title? Because it was mentioned a few times that might not be your preference on which way to go. So what alternatives would you suggest for that?
I'll let Tom take that.
You can simply put experience, because that's what it is. I mean, it's experience, whether it's professional experience, whether it is experience as a graduate student, whether you have an opportunity to be a fellow in another department as a professional staff member, it's experience. So, I actually, on my resume, it is actually just experience, because as we mentioned before, it can be used as a catch-all. Whether I'm working, full-time, whether it's an internship, whether it's, whatever else. It's one of those catch-all type of titles that can be used.
And I would add that even though, and I like I would add that I like the experience heading, because it can also put in the things that are not necessarily super relevant. Some employers are not going to want things that are not relevant, like part-time jobs that you did to make a little bit of extra money, like waiting or busing or whatever other jobs, retail. But I personally like those. I like those to be included, maybe at the bottom, and maybe in a other experience section. But I'm okay with it being in the just experience section, because it tells me about that story of who you are. You were a hardworking person that was able to manage, wear multiple hats and have different aspects of your life, and I'm okay with that, especially if it helps fill a gap. If you had to take a semester or a year off to pay some bills, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and I want to know about it. I would rather know that you had to work professionally in something unrelated for a year to pay your bills, rather than there just be a gap of a year or a semester that I don't know what you were doing, where you just sitting on the couch all day for a semester. I don't know that, but if you put that you were a waiter for that semester, there's nothing wrong with that. And I waited tables, and for me, it's a point of being able to relate to a candidate.
So the next question is, going back to what you talked about, including Photoshop and other skills, is it important to be careful on how you word that to make sure that there's universal understanding?
Yeah, I think that sorry, Tom. I think that the main thing you want to make sure that you put on is that not everyone. Donald makes up a really good point in the way the question was asked, because not everyone is going to be familiar with everything. I am myself very tech savvy, but I don't know a lot of software that is creative in nature. So if you want to put Adobe Suite, that doesn't say as much to me as, say, Adobe Captivate or Adobe Photoshop. So being as specific as possible, you don't want to put Adobe Suite or Apple products or things like that. I think that you want to try to be as specific as possible. That's what I would say. Tom, were you going to add to that as well?
Yeah, well, I think you can, in a section like that, you can put a small, like description. Maxient is conduct software. So you could put proficient with Maxient, parentheses, conduct software, or whether it's Adirondack Solutions or StarRes or any other housing-oriented software. You could put assignments software or housing software. Those are the types of things that are okay. For the most part, staff in housing are fairly familiar with a lot of the different softwares out there, but it's also an opportunity for us to look at and say, hadn't heard of that, wonder what that is, and give us an opportunity to kind of look that up, and it could be something very exciting. I mean, there's a lot of new things happening, and companies popping up that are offering different ways for housing professionals and RAs to interact and track those interactions with their students. And sometimes we're not always up on what is current and the new things that are coming out. I will say, though, if you put that you're proficient in something, be prepared to prove it. Because if I'm hiring somebody and they say that they're proficient in Photoshop, or they're proficient with Maxient, I'm going to expect them to be proficient with Photoshop and to be proficient with Maxient.
And I would also add one thing that Tom reminded me. There is a lot of software that's coming out now, both open source and sort of closed environments. With the open source software, a lot of them, universities are doing what's called skinning that version of the software. So for those of you that have used content and class management resources like Classes, it's been called, I've seen it called, Blackboard is essentially what it is. So, but a lot of times you have to be able to look for what the root software is. So NYU, for example, has NYU Classes, which is a skin of Sakai software. So you don't want to put on your resume, or I wouldn't put on my resume NYU Classes. I would put, proficient in NYU's version of Sakai. Maybe not in those words, obviously, but my point is that making sure that you're talking about versions or sort of the root software.
So another question was, should someone include experience that is not relevant just so that there are no gaps on their resume?
I said this before, absolutely.
Again, this is one of those subjective things for me. I look at relevancy, and yes, if someone's going to have gaps, then for me, that'll be, I'm going to ask them about those gaps, and if they can simply say that, hey, I was working in retail, that's fine for me. Again, between Jonathan and I, those are one of the subjective differences. I don't necessarily see as relevant. It potentially is taking up space, and for me, you can explain that. That's something that can come up easily in conversation at an interview, or in some other informal or formal setting. So you can go either way.
So in other industries, organizations use software to scan resumes for keywords. Is that the practice in student affairs?
I wouldn't necessarily call it a student affairs practice. I would say that it's a human resources practice.
Yes.
Some schools, many schools, don't have control over the initial, that first level screening of applicants. Once somebody puts in their information into the human resources application, human resources then puts that through whatever processes that they have to narrow down potentially a candidate pool, and then that narrowed down pool is sent to the hiring department. So unfortunately, as a student affairs practice, we tend to just look at everything that gets sent to us. If you're sending resumes directly or applying through a placement exchange, but when it comes to that screening, that is typically a human resources function that is out of the control of hiring departments.
Yeah, and if you were to apply to a job at NYU, our human resources does use that software to scan. Just using NYU as an example. But if you're applying through the placement exchange, not all universities will have that before screening candidates.
And I was going to add that it really just depends on the school and what their practice is, because, for example, at Towson, all resumes and everything are screened by human resources before I can even look at them. And so it just really depends on the school on what that practice is. And so I think a good point of advice regardless is when you're thinking about content, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, looking at position descriptions and other things to make sure that you're hitting some of the key areas for the employer. The next question was, I've heard that you should not leave a page half empty. Would it be better to add or take out points in order to keep them full pages?
I don't necessarily have a problem with it. Again, it is, hate to sound like a broken record, but it's subjective. I think if you have taken a serious look at your resume, you've taken a fine-tooth comb to the content, you are positive that everything that you've listed is relevant, and there's really nothing else that you can add aside from fillers, then I don't have a problem with a page and a half. But if you are looking at your resume and you realize that there are things that you can cut down on, then try to do that. You can also consider if you are a couple lines into your next page, if you have a quarter of the page, a third of the page, or whatever it is, consider other things that you can tweak that won't really create a huge visual difference. So if you have inch margins at the top and an inch and a quarter at the left and right, make them all an inch, or go down to 3/4 of an inch. If you're using 12-point font for everything, consider what is it going to look like if you went down to 11-point font. Play around with those things that you can that potentially will give you a little more room or take it away. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that to give yourself 2 full pages, you increase your margins. You rarely want to increase your margins, but you don't want to go too narrow with your margins as well.
Then the next question is, I'm sorry, Jonathan, were you going to add something?
I was just going to add that it is subjective, but I actually, I'm one of the people that does kind of look at if you have a little bit less than half a page on the second page, then I think that you can cut that down for the most part. So I'm okay with like 3/4 of the page, but to be subjective, to again belabor that point of subjectivity, I am one of those people. While Tom may not mind, I kind of mind a little bit, and again, that's something that you may want to choose for yourself.
So then the next question is that I have my bachelor's degree in graphic design, and I feel that this is the one thing that makes me stand out. one, should I include that on my resume? And then two, does that give employers a chance to assume what they should expect from me on a skill level?
Yeah, I
Well,
think you should absolutely include it. I'm sorry, Tom. You should absolutely include it in your education, number one. And I think that if I see graphic design on the undergraduate level, if I'm looking at that resume, I will probably skip straight down to the skill section and look to see what I see there. If I don't see a skill section, or if I don't see it, then that's a missed opportunity. Um, that's something that you can really go to town and put all of the software and all of the different styles that that candidate is familiar with.
I would also say, and Don, I'm sorry for not taking a look more closely, but regarding cover letters, that is it's an ideal place to include part of that experience. To talk about where you may have been able to utilize that experience as part of other work that may be kind of skewing back to relevancy with whatever job you're applying for. Talking about that is a great part or a great place to do it within the cover letter.
Then the next question is, I have professional or if I have professional experience after my master's and graduate experience and post-bachelor's experience, one, is it okay to have a little bit longer resume, or should I stick to 2 pages? And then number two is, should I split professional experience, post-master's, and all my other experience?
I would, I think something that I would start with is I would put everything down. Take a look at what your resume looks like with all the content there. Stay with the chronological piece. Put everything chronologically, and then take a look to see what your resume looks like. From there, then you can consider paring back. Do you need this particular thing? Again, for me, it's relevancy. Is it does it serve a purpose for me to understand that about you as a candidate? We've had graduate students here that have spent years in the K through 12 field and then come to graduate school to pursue higher education. That's relevant. Teaching, developing students. That's all part of what we do, and that's all also things that the K-12 field does. So I don't necessarily think that you have to, if you have the experience, if you have the different positions, then just because you're just finishing a master's program does not mean that you have to stay at that 2-page limit. The traditional age master's level student, master's level individual will typically be at that 2 pages.
Yeah, Tom got that answer pretty good, so I don't have anything to add.
Donald, were there any other questions?
Oh, sorry, I was muted, and I definitely asked one. So to fill space then, would you recommend adding references to your resume?
I would say no. References is a separate document. It shouldn't be a filler, and you shouldn't look for things to be fillers. If a school asks you to submit a single document, resume and references, that references piece will start on the very next page. It shouldn't be a continuation, right from the last thing you have on your resume, and then go directly into your references on that same page.
This is, again, that subjective piece, because it depends on who you are as a candidate, because if you're one of those candidates that is undergrad straight to master's and moving into your first professional position, and you may not have enough content to fill up 2 pages, but you're also not quite at 1 page, I'm okay with you putting your references on the bottom of the second page to fill up the space. I personally am okay with that. But again, if you are a person with 3 or 4 years of professional experience and you do that to fill up the second page, then that's not a good move. And I would have some serious questions about why you don't have enough as a professional from 4 or 5 years, why you don't have enough to fill up 2 pages.
So for the sake of time, there's 3 more questions that are on here. And so Tom and Jonathan, can I ask that for the next couple of questions, just one of you answer pretty quickly so that we can try to get through all of them. Someone gave me advice to change my resume and cover letter completely for each school that I'm interested in. But I'm also interested in applying at TPE. So what would you suggest?
I can take that one, Jonathan.
Sure.
I would say it depends on the position. If you are applying for positions that are standard, whether they're all hall director positions or they're all academic advisor positions or things like that, then there's no need to make those changes. You can have a cover letter. The resume, especially, your resume shouldn't be changing per institution if they're all similar positions. Your cover letters, you can come up with a fairly standard cover letter for the type of position as long as you're consistent. But you also want to pay attention to what you have to edit, because some schools, they're resident directors, some schools, they're hall directors, some schools, they're coordinators. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with that advice that resumes and cover letters should be completely different or change with every single institution you apply for.
And then if in the coming semester we'll be adding an experience, for example, teaching, but I'm submitting an application now, how would you suggest advocating for those skills?
That's something that you can talk about in your cover letter, especially if it's something that is very, very related to the position that you're applying to. I think that if you don't want to fudge and sort of lie on your resume, but if, for example, if maybe you started training for that teaching experience this semester, I don't see anything particularly wrong with putting it in your resume currently. However, that's something that's a little bit trickier if you don't have sort of training or anything that starts a little bit more in the present. But it's something that you can definitely talk about in your cover letter as well as in the interview.
Then the last question that we'll do for the day is I work with student athletes and many of them have no significant work experience. So what suggestions do you have for student athletes where most have little or no true work experience but have essential skills that some employers find valuable? I'm always looking for ways to guide athletes on showcasing their resume, the skills and experiences that they learned from competing in high-level sports.
I actually love that question because it's very similar to what I see with some of my students as the internship coordinator. I often talk to students about in a very narrative sort of way, asking them, well, what do you do? Okay, you play a sport. Okay, what role do you play on your team? What does it take to complete that role? What does it take to be an athlete? And having that conversation really begins to draw out some of the skills that are needed for different kinds of positions, whether it be strategy, whether it be planning, whether it be some of the types of skills that you need to be able to consistently be persistent with different initiatives. And having those conversations will begin to play out the language that will end up on the resume and the cover letter. And I also don't discount the opportunity for student involvement as in clubs, because I do have athletes that are less able to maybe have a job, but more able to be in a club, and I think that can also still be very valuable experience to athletes. And do they take leadership roles in their team, or are they just the guy that shows up to practice 5 minutes late and leaves 5 minutes early? Being a leader in the team is also very important.
So again, thank you, Tom and Jonathan, for providing all of your insight on the webinar today. For any candidates who are still on the webinar, if you need to get in contact with us, again, our social media is listed, as well as our email address at the bottom, and so we're always happy to continue to answer any questions that you might have. For the next time, please make sure that you join us. Our next webinar is going to be on Thursday, November 3rd, where we're going to talk about networking, resume content, which one of the questions also specifically asked about talking about cover letters, and we'll make sure that is included in the resume content on Wednesday, November 16th. And then navigating TPE on-site on a fixed budget will be on Wednesday, December 14th. So please make sure that you join us, and have a great day.